for the folks on the call who are who are blind and or low vision, I want to give a visual description of what you're seeing in terms of Amelia and I right now, right? And so in terms of myself, name is Melissa, she, her pronouns. I'm a fat, white, masculine of center woman. I've got a short haircut. It's a little too short. It just got cut yesterday. So I'm having that moment about, oh, do I want my hair back? I'm wearing gold rim glasses and a gold nose ring, got a white t-shirt on and a navy blue button up with tangerines on it. Amelia, if you could just introduce yourself and your pronouns and then give that visual description, and then just tell us about your artwork generally.
Okay. I am Amelia. Hi, everyone. Again, she, her pronouns. And I am wearing a purple dress. I have big curly hair. Your typical racially ambiguous mixed person. Black and white is the combo. And yeah, in terms of my artistic practice, I am a filmmaker and cultural producer and multidisciplinary artist. I have actually like the little couple sentences that I use in my application. I feel like it's helpful to hear how I described it, because just diving right in, what I found to be really useful was trying to understand the language of the granting organization and then folding yourself into that language and then using the rest of the application to reinforce your explanation of yourself. So what I used to describe myself in that initial question about my social change practice is that as a cultural producer, art activist, and filmmaker, I use educational participatory art as a tool to confront social injustice and organize communities to create a more equitable future. In the past 8 years, I have used film, installation art, and creative programming to engage themes of human rights, police accountability, sexual liberation, as well as racial and economic justice. So that is like a mouthful, but it's just like an example of how to describe all that you've done and probably years and years and years of work in a concise way, and then kind of find those keywords and then keep reinforcing the explanation behind those keywords and key elements.
Mm-hmm. I love that you just dove us right in. You were like, introduction, I'm going to just give you a little application already, right?
That's pretty much it. We could end this.
Right, that's it. Thank you for coming, everyone. No, but it's this moment around how do you describe what you do in a character count, right? Especially if you've been working for several years, at least 5 years to apply for this award. And then just like some folks got decades of work under their belt, right? And so how do they describe that in a way that feels accessible to the panel, but also indicative of the work that they do, right? And so I think you just gave us a little bit of what worked for your application, of how you describe your practice. And so we'll dive a little bit deeper as we go through this evening, but thank you for that. I appreciate it. In terms of tonight, we'll be focusing on the Transformation Award. If you have questions throughout the night, feel free to drop them in the chat. If you're here and listening, I'll pause at certain sections throughout tonight to ask if there's questions. And then of course, we'll wrap up with a general question and answer session. And so feel free to drop them in the chat, and Gabe and I will get to them at certain points throughout the evening. So please use that chat. That's why it's there for. The other thing that you should keep in mind is like, you can learn more about the Transformation Award online at leeway.org. That's our website. You can see the Transformation Award guidelines, both in English and Spanish, depending on what your preference is. And so look out for a couple of those links coming through the chat right now. You can also reach out to Gabe and I directly. Our emails are on the website, or you can email info@leeway.org with any questions or concerns, or even if you just need some thought partnership as you go through this application. The other thing I want you to know right at the top is that we don't decide who gets these grants on Leeway's staff or board. It's always a peer panel making these decisions. And so what that frees us up to do is we can have one-on-one applicant support meetings with potential applicants, which is really like the joy of our life. So please, if you are thinking about needing some support in this application process, there are a slew of different applicant support sessions coming up where we can meet one-on-one and talk about your specific application. And we'll throw that link in the chat. But also, if none of those times work, feel free to reach out to us and we'll try to fit you into the schedule, even if it's not on those dates. I will say this, if it is the day before the deadline and you're reaching out trying to get on the schedule, that's tough, okay? So try to get at us sooner than later so that we can make sure that we make the time and the space for you to get all the support that you need in this process. Gabe, will you pull our slides up so that we can give folks some visuals? Thank you. All right, folks, on your screen, you should be seeing a couple slides. There is the effervescent, wonderful Amelia Carter on your screen. You'll also see some of our assets for the year designed by this amazing artist, Kai Yangni, who is a great Philly creator and maker. So check them out for sure. And then a gentle reminder that the deadline's May 15th. And we can go to the next slide. So I want to tell you a little bit about like who is Leeway, right? And for those of you on the call, I think you know, but I just want to give just a general quick overview for folks who may not be familiar. We support women, trans, and or gender nonconforming artists and cultural producers living in greater Philadelphia area who are working essentially at the intersection of art and social change. For us, the greater Philadelphia area means Bucks, Camden, Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, and Philadelphia counties. Our grants are for individual artists. We do not fund 501c3s or LLCs, but collectives are definitely welcome to apply. So if you're an individual artist working with 2 or 3 other people, come on through. We support collectives, but we write our checks to individual artists. So keep that in mind. A lot of grant money is earmarked for 501c3s in our area, but we cut the checks to people. The other thing you should know about Leeway is that we seek to recognize artists whose work is often ignored, silenced, or marginalized because of who they are and or what they create, right? So we're really focused on people of color, immigrants, queer, trans, or gender nonconforming folks, poor and working class people, or just generally people who take risk with their art form and their content to share their social change vision. And then the other thing to keep in mind is we accept applications in English and Spanish across all our grant making programs. And we also, for LTA, we accept hard copy applications and also online applications. So you get to pick what format works essentially best for your life. We'll take a look at those a little bit later. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, before we transition from this slide, this is Ada Trio on the slide, and you should know her. We'll give you a couple examples of LTA recipients besides the amazing Amelia who's with us tonight. But this is Ada. This is some photo documentation from some work she did around amplifying the stories of queer and trans asylum seekers on the US-Mexican border. Ada received the Transformation Award in 2021 for her visual artwork, mostly photography based. And if you want to support Ada, you can see her sort of Instagram tag below. Now we can go to the next slide. So art for social change, right? We award folks who are working at the intersection of what we call art and social change. But what do we actually mean by that? Essentially, we just mean that it's art with a vision and an intentional analysis. And that vision impacts not just a few individuals, but communities for change. Essentially, your art has community impact that ripples beyond just you and a few people, right? You could be doing some really transformative painting in your basement, and that could be a hella transformative practice for you in your basement. But if you never put it on the wall somewhere or share it with other people in your community, how does that transformation ripple beyond you? The questions that run through our grant making is, how does your art create action, and how does your art engage and impact community, right? And we know that art for social change can operate in lots of different ways. It can be traditional, non-traditional, it can be various different disciplines, and it can raise consciousness. It can be a tool for strategy, or strategy for organizing and movement build it. It can preserve or reclaim traditional practices. It can create space for a community or expression that isn't valued. And it can do a whole lot more. This isn't meant to be a checklist, but these are just a couple things that art for social change can do. The biggest questions to think about as you're, tossing around, is my work art for social change based, is how does the art create action, and how does it engage and impact community? Two really big questions in our process. On the right of this slide, you'll see Ria Tajiri, and then you'll see Ria's mother. This is actually a still from some of her film work called Wisdom Gone Wild. It was a film focused on dementia and caregiving. Ria received the LTA in 2020 after applying multiple times for it, and really listening to the panel's feedback and taking it into account, and then eventually receiving this award for her film and media-based work. Next slide, please. So what do we fund and who decides, right? We fund all different kinds of artistic practices, traditional, non-traditional, basically everything but the kitchen sink. If it is an artistic practice to you and you have an articulation of how it is an artistic practice, make the case for it in this application. We fund, visual artists, dancers, actors, media makers, hair braiders, aromatherapists, DJs, and then literally the culinary artist, and the list goes on. You'll see some of those folks on the slide, like Kenyosi Yvette Smalls, who has transitioned. And so I want to just call her name out and tell her to rest in power. She received the LTA in 2008. Her discipline was folk arts, but she was a really fierce hair braider, and looked at her hair braiding as an artistic practice and as sort of a cultural preservation piece of her community. It's people like Mary Baxter, also known as Isis the Savior, received the Transformation Award in 2019 with a music discipline, and came in really thinking about the intersection of her own sort of story of incarceration, but how music could be a conduit for change around decarceration and sort of ending sort of this school to pipeline, the school to prison pipeline, real talk. And then last but not least, you'll see Whit Lopez here. Whit Lopez is a multidisciplinary creator, received the Transformation Award in 2019, and is just a fierce artist who's really thinking about queer and trans identities and how those identities are valued, preserved, and created space around. So grant decisions aren't made by staff or board. Just to reiterate that, it is the joy and the challenge of our life that we do not make these decisions, but there's a trusted rotating peer panel. Every year it changes, of community-based artists and cultural producers. So we're here to support you on staff. Please know that. There's that link for the applicant support sessions. And the other thing I want to just forefront before we dig in with Amelia is every applicant who applies to Leeway receives feedback from the panel, should they want it. If you can totally opt out of feedback, if you're not into feedback, you can be like, no, thank you, I don't want it. You can click no on the application. But feedback is a right, not a luxury. If you spend your time and energy doing an application, you should understand why the panel has said yes or why the panel has said no. And so even if you progress to stage 2 or not of this process, you'll have an understanding of what the panel was excited by, and also what the panel may have had questions or concerns about. Amelia, that's sort of the general rundown of, Leeway and the Transformation Award, but is there anything you think people should know about Leeway as we dig in to this process?
Just that Melissa, Gabe, and the whole rest of the team is incredibly supportive. Definitely take advantage of the one-on-one sessions. I think that's probably one of the most valuable things you can do. And also do not leave this. This was like one of the key things that still stick in my head from my info session. And thankfully it was advice that I followed. Do not leave this for the last minute. This is not one of those types of grants that you can just like, shoot out and get it out there. It takes, the questions are very thoughtful and take a lot of like honing in order to honing your responses in order to fit the character limits, which might not be the same character limit on your Google Doc. You might find that if you paste it inside of the box, like things don't line up, and that type of stuff also happens. And also just a lot of honing because they are thoughtful questions. So just keep that in mind, start early, go to the opportunities to get feedback from staff. And yeah, those are the main highlights, I would say.
Thank you for calling that out, Amelia. This moment of like, yes, it's just, it's an experience page, a short bio and 6 questions, which doesn't feel like a gargantuan lift, but those 6 questions, for instance, one of them is like, who are you and what has led you here? That's a big question, right? And so that takes some time, right? That takes some thinking. So even if you're not writing it, I tell folks to just look at the questions, keep them in your mind so that as you're dropping your kid off to school or as you're cooking dinner one night, the back of your mind is at least thinking about them. Or you host a dinner party. We've had some applicants who host a dinner party and they're like, I don't know what my impact is. Can someone, what about my trusted community? Can they give me a sense of what the impact is? And so call on Leeway, call on yourself to make the space, and then also call on your community to help you with these questions. Because yes, there's only 6 of them, but they are deep. And they're gonna demand that you dig into yourself to think about them. So thank you for that reminder, Amelia. Really appreciate it. Next slide. Transformation Award, $15,000 unrestricted dollars. I love unrestricted funding because it means you can do whatever you want to do with it. And that's the best kind of funding. You don't have to do a project or anything like that. You just get to get it and use it for your life. Love that. It's for an award for someone who has done art for social change-based work for 5 years or more. And so you need to demonstrate sort of at least a 5-year commitment to your art for social change practice, right? It's not project-based grant. And so this isn't for work that you want to do. This is an award recognizing work that you have already done and have already done for 5 years or more. Let's talk about what it looks like in terms of the process. And so next slide, please. All right. Transformation Award is given to 10 to 12 individuals each year. It's a 2-stage process. The deadline for stage 1 is what's coming up. It's May 15th, and I'm going to give you the time that the application literally closes. It is going to close exactly at midnight. And so your deadline is May 15th at 11:59 p.m. I tell you the time because if you're like me or many of us in this world, we're busy and we have to wait to the last minute to do stuff sometimes, right? I'm going to highly recommend you don't, just in case tech is teching. Mercury is also in retrograde until May 14th. And so just keep that in mind for communication. And if you need our help, we can't help you at 11:55 that night. We are with our families, we're asleep, we're living our best lives, and we're not online at 11:50. And so if you get at least a day ahead of it, or a few hours even, we can support you in any tech challenges that may arise. We usually see 75 to 90 people apply for stage 1. Out of that batch of 75 to 90, about 30 people are invited to return to stage 2. The panel will select up to 30 to come back for stage 2. That decision, folks will find out if they made it to stage 2 or not in late July. And then if you do make it to stage 2, there's another application and work samples that you get to submit. And that deadline is in October. And then the final awardees receive sort of notification if they got it or not in mid-December. And so you can see this is sort of a long process, with the first deadline May 15th and final awardees not finding out until right before the end of the year in December. And so take care of yourself during this process, whether you are just stage 1 or go to both stages, and really, really think about how you'll tap us in and tap your community in for that support. Next slide. The eligibility. All right. To be eligible, you have to have lived in one of our funding counties for at least 2 years, right? You've got 5 years under your belt, at least, of art for social change work, but at least 2 years of it has to be, or you have to be living here for 2 years. So that's basically since April 2021, okay? You have to be at least 18 years old. You have to identify as a woman, trans, and or gender nonconforming person, and you have to be creating art for social change for at least 5 years. So that's just the basic eligibility. You cannot apply if you are a full-time student in an arts degree granting program. You could be a full-time student in a non-arts degree granting program. That's okay. You could be a part-time student in an arts degree granting program. That's okay too. But if you're a full-time student in an arts degree granting program, there's likely some coin that you can harness, likely through your university or your place of education. And so we ask that you not apply for this. You can't have previously received the Transformation Award. You can only receive the Transformation Award once. You can't receive a media artist and activist residency, which is another grant stream we have from last year in 2022. And then if you are a previous Leeway grant recipient, we just need your final reports from any of your previous projects. I'm just highlighting the eligibility for you tonight, but all these guidelines can be found on our website at leeway.org/LTA, or and you'll find like a handy dandy PDF there, but also on the online application. Next slide. Amelia, what actually encouraged you to apply? Because you met the basic eligibility, but how did you know it was time for you to like do the damn thing?
Well, I got encouragement from you, which was really helpful. But also I would say, you know, that happened because I had applied to other Leeway grants in the past for many years and had not gotten them. And I would just encourage people to keep in mind, because I used to apply to grants and get really discouraged when I wouldn't get them, and take it really personally. And I would just remind people that each grant application you write, you should look at it as an introduction to that granting community, and a stepping stone. So to not be expectant that you might get something on the first shot. If that happens, it's great. But to keep in mind that, you know, you're introducing yourself, and maybe it's not this year, but maybe it's a future year when, you know, you can hone your language in the right way, or you have evolved enough as an artist that it's the right time, or it's just the right people on the committee at the right time, whatever the reason that people get grants over other people, to just keep that in mind. So I had just been in a place in my work where I was just diligently applying to all types of things. And, you know, Leeway, this award in particular, it's like a rites of passage in Philadelphia. So I just was determined to get something in Leeway to pop off at some point in time. And it finally did. I'm excited.
I'm actually so excited. I'm so excited. I'm actually so glad that you actually shared in full transparency that you applied for some other streams of funding and didn't receive them. I think that's a real story, right? That's a real moment. And honesty that I really appreciate that you lifted up here, right? Because just because you haven't been successful before doesn't mean that you won't be successful, right? Or maybe it was a no for this stream of funding, but for this one, you're in a different place or there's a different priority or an alignment that's part of this work, right? And it's also a different panel. I think the tough thing
Mhm.
about grant making is it's not a perfect process, number one, and it's also a reductive process, right? Meaning that the amount of qualified applicants is always greater than the amount of money that we have to move out into the community, right? And so it's never a question of, is the work, the panel's never thinking about, is the work good or bad? That's too binary, especially for Leeway, right? But they're thinking about whose work from the articulation in this application can I picture and can I understand clearly, right? And whose work creates action around their social change intentions and engages and impacts the community. Again, those two really big questions. In terms of what the application itself looks like, it's not gargantuan. There's basic contact info. Check, you got that off. A short artist bio. We're going to ask you to pick something called a social change intention. We're going to ask you to identify at least one, but no more than three of these categories that basically best describe the intention or vision behind your work. Leeway doesn't define these categories for you. We give you sort of some buckets to choose from, but there's room in your application to define what racial justice means for you, or to define what feminism means to you, or what feminism does not mean to you, right? There's room for you to talk about what trans justice and gender self-determination looks like for you, or what immigrant justice, what thread of that runs through your work. There's literally a question in the application. It's question number 3 in the application that will directly ask you what your social change intents were. What did you pick? And how does your artistic practice engage with these social change intents? And so as you're selecting them, and we'll see them in just a minute, I'll ask Gabe to pull up the application in just a moment. But really be thoughtful about what you choose here. And there is no one size fits all sort of selection. It's what feels like is at the core and the heart of your work, essentially. Sometimes people think that picking 3 intents is better than just picking 1. And you should pick the amount of intents that your work actually engages with, because sometimes more is not more. If you select 3 social change intents, the panel is going to be reading your application with the lens of those 3 social change intents on them. So if you choose racial justice and they don't see you talking about racial justice in your art practice, they're going to have a question for you about, hey, you said that racial justice was like at the core of your work. How does your work push that movement forward? Right? They might have some questions about that. Amelia, do you remember what your social change intentions were?
Yes, mine was LGBTQA social movements and racial and economic justice.
Yes. And then how did you figure out that those were your intents? And then how did you talk about them in your application even?
So I do a lot of different things. And so it can be a little bit intimidating to figure out, what even are my practices that I'm going to identify, and also what's the intent. I think that I helped to narrow both of those down by talking to you at those info sessions, again, why it's helpful. But essentially how I spoke about it. So you're going to find that, especially when you get to that question, you're going to have too much to say. It's going to be like maybe a long essay that comes out of you. And what I did was identify a few different projects, like the keystone projects and initiatives that I worked on over that several year period. And I was just like, no matter what, I need to work these projects into this very tightly worded application within these 6 questions. So once I identified those, let's say it was 6 different things that fit within those 2 categories of basically queer social movements and racial and economic justice, I found ways to weave those projects in as examples to each of the rest of the questions that were asked. And that way, that was like my strategy. So you basically, your intro to the question is like basically you directly answering the question as concisely as possible to make sure you actually cover that. And then you reinforce what your answer is with an example of your work. And all of that in the end feeds back into that original notion that you made, which is your intent. My case was queer social movements and racial and economic justice. If that makes sense.
Thank you so much for that. Essentially, you were just talking about like, I had to take a step back and think about what are the projects that I've worked on, right? Like, what are the buckets of work that I have? Because maybe not all the buckets fit into this application, right? There's no way that you can talk about all of your work in Leeway's application. You have to really take a step back and think about what story am I going to tell about who I am as an artist for social change, right? And so when you were talking, Amelia, about like, what are the projects that I might lift up as examples in this application? What are the themes or the core intents of those projects, right? Because if I am invited to stage 2, I'm going to be asked for work samples, and I'm probably going to have to lift one of these projects up, right? And in your case, you got to lift up Testimony 52nd Street, which is a beautiful stop motion animation. Is that wrong? It's animation of some sort.
Correct. Yep, stop motion.
Will
Thank
you
you.
describe 52nd Street for folks who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so that was one of the main works that I spotlighted. It's called Testimony 52nd Street and the Invisible Violence of UPenn. It was about the tear gassing of 52nd Street in 2020, and the fact that the University of Pennsylvania's private police force participated in that crackdown. So in that period of my life, I was doing activism related to not only holding the public police department of Philadelphia responsible, but also pursuing questioning and justice around the private police force's participation in that crackdown, of which there were 5 different entities that participated. And so in my application, I separated that work out and gave specific examples of the art organizing I did related to the PPD, and specific organizing I did, art organizing related to Penn's private policing. And that was the piece that I worked on for the Penn's private policing. And it was an 8-minute short documentary that, or short stop motion film based off of testimony that I gave about my experience.
It's a really gorgeous short, folks. In the chat, you'll see a link to the trailer for it. Amelia, I hope you don't mind that I just shared the link to the trailer.
Yeah, great.
The big takeaway that I heard you thinking about was like, what story am I going to tell? And somebody who also received the Transformation Award, Jermaine Ingram, a really talented dancer and artist. She recently said you have to think about how you want to choreograph as a dancer, this metaphor word for her, how you want to choreograph your application, right? You can't tell all the stories. You can't do all the dances, but what dance or story are you going to do, right? And so taking a step back and thinking, what have I worked on that is aligned with some of these social change intents might be the buckets that you need to get in line before you even start answering these questions in the application. And so it's a really good way to think about it, Amelia. Thank you for that. Another thing you'll see in the application before we pull it up and take a look at it is something called the experience page. Now, Leeway does not ask for an artist resume or a CV. And it also doesn't ask for work samples in stage one. And so instead, what Leeway asks for is 4 to 10 personal, professional, or political experiences that have led you to your work as an artist today. The reason Leeway doesn't ask for work samples or an artist resume in the first stage is we're trying to honor the applicant's journey and experience as an artist. I think this is especially important for artists who might not have traditional or formal arts education. These artists may not have been exhibited in traditional galleries or have been recognized by institutions, but they have been 100% doing their art for social change work and community for years, right? And so how do we create an application process that feels equitable to folks on the spectrum of their art for social change career and practice? And having an experience page over just valuing a shiny work sample, at least in the stage one application, felt important to who we are and why we do this work. A tip for the experience page, use all 10 of those spaces, or use more than 4, right? You've got 10, utilize them. That experience page is a story about how you actually got to this moment in your practice. It's essentially like a chapter in your book, right? And balance the personal and professional. Don't just recreate a resume here, right? Get them interested in why you do the work that you do and what led you to that moment, right? What are the things over the course of your practice or even your life that have shaped you into the artist you are today? Each experience, I know they look short, but they can be up to 2 sentences. If you're literally in the online form, you have 325 characters to play with there. That is the exact amount, okay? So instead of writing something like, I attended the Allied Media Conference, okay, that starts to tell them a thing, but what if they don't know what the Allied Media Conference is? And why was going to the Allied Media Conference so impactful for you? Give the panel just a little bit more about why attending that conference mattered. So you might say, like, I attended the Allied Media Conference and it was the first time I got to share my work with media makers for change. That's different. That's telling a different story to the panel. That's helping them understand why that thing was important in your career and your trajectory. And the additional context could really make or break how the panel understands you and your work. After you list those 4 to 10 experiences, you get to choose one of those experiences as sort of your highlighted experience, where you get to expand on more detail about, like why that experience was so impactful and has led you to this moment in your artistic career today. There's no right or wrong experience, especially for your highlighted experience, but we strongly recommend that your highlighted experience is the most compelling one in terms of your relationship to your artistic practice that you're talking about in your application. So how do you create the thread from your experience page right into your questions that are going to describe your art for social change practice, which is literally flip the page, the next one for the panelists to read. Amelia, how did you figure out what you were going to include on your experience page, and how did you sort of approach this piece of the application?
I couldn't have said it better than what you just said. That component of this is telling a story for the rest of your application. I tend to do a lot of things at once, and it gets very confusing and very convoluted very quickly, especially because you're trying to, say this thing is related to that and this is that, and keep it clear and concise. So the experience section was a way for me to create a timeline that really clearly and effectively mapped out my journey as an organizer and how my organizing work was weaved into my art practice, and how, that was not mutually exclusive. So that's how I kind of laid it out. And it helped me also identify what those project buckets that I really wanted to focus on throughout the rest of the application. This really helped me to identify what those were and how I could weave the story of all of these different intersections of my life together to tell one coherent story, and how one thing informed the next and the next.
Yeah, it was a really skillful experience page, Amelia. You used all 10 really wisely, right? You
Oh.
were like, I'm going to give you these buckets that you had or these projects that you had run, but you were also giving about why they were so impactful for your practice, right? And so I think you did an excellent job there. If you don't mind, I'd love to lift one of them up for folks right now, if you're open.
Sure.
Amazing.
Go for it.
And so I'm going to lift up one of the experiences from Amelia's application right now. And so I'll do the one from March 2021. You gave the date. You said, with support from the Penn Community for Justice, I wrote, directed, and produced the short film Testimony, 52nd Street, and the Invisible Violence of UPenn. The film was a winner of Black Stars Film Festival Shine Award, and it explored private policing and community demands from mega nonprofits to pay pilots, right? And you had already previously defined what pilots were, and that is payments in lieu of taxes, earlier in your application. And so you gave this, in just that sort of experience, you gave us what the project was about, the Testimony 52nd Street. You told us kind of nonchalantly that it won an award at Black Star Film Festival, right? But that wasn't the important thing for you, right? It was around how it was exploring policing and community demands for pilots. So it's just a really good use of all your space there in those 325 characters. You also gave us this moment of like, maybe something that wouldn't be on a resume. You gave us this moment about a mentorship program that you went through as part of your experience page as well, right? That taught you how to use film essentially to create social change. So it wasn't this gargantuan project, but this really meaningful mentorship program that you had gone through that led you to this moment in your career. And so really skillful use of your experience page. And then
Thank
last
you.
but not least on this application is sort of what we call the description of your art for social change work. And these are the 6 questions. It's essentially the bulk of the application. Don't let the questions scare you, even though they're deep. Essentially, the questions are asking who you are, what your art for social change work looks like, and how it engages the community. Those are the 3 big buckets. If we were to boil it down, who you are, what your art for social change work looks like, and how it engages the community. Sometimes, I think folks get to these questions and they see, they see it's a grant. We already have baggage around applying for grants a lot of the time. And you see the questions and you think, oh no, there's no way I can answer them. You have the answers to all of these questions. And we do not expect you to write in a certain grant language or a flowery speak or overly academic language. Just show up as who you are in this grant application and stay true to yourself about how you would answer these questions if we were sitting across the table from each other. Don't let that internal editor come in and scare you away from actually answering it or talking as you would if we were sitting together, right? Yes, there are character counts, so you have to be thoughtful about what you say, but I think it really matters that you're true to yourself as you answer these questions here. Gabe, will you do me a favor? Will you click
Yes.
on the hard copy and online app found here so we can see them?
Sure. The hard copy first.
Sure. Thank you. Also, Gabe, you're doing the Lord's work on the back of doing this right now, so I just want to give you your accolades.
Thanks. Can you see the PDF?
We cannot, unfortunately.
All right. I think let me stop this
Thank you so
and
much.
then just share my whole screen with folks.
Amelia, while Gabe pulls that up, how did you start digging in to these 6 questions? I think you're on.
Yes. So yeah, the way that I think I did it was I kind of like poured my heart out into one long essay. Starting with the work that was already done with the timeline. So the timeline really, or the experience, that really set me up to be able to start explaining how all of that weaved together. And after just getting the gist of what the questions were, like trying to basically explain myself as to how I see myself aligning with these questions more vaguely. And then from there, I had enough language to work with to kind of to start copying and pasting and putting together the application like a Frankenstein kind of situation. And then I refined from there.
Totally. That's a really, I hear different ways that people approach the application, but that's a common way where folks are just like, I read through the questions and then I just give myself the space to just think freely about it. They essentially are doing what I call lovingly a shitty first draft, right?
Right.
So
Exactly that.
they do the draft and then they think about like, ooh, what are the gems in the rubble? So I don't need that, but ooh, this could fit under 3 or this could fit under 6, right? And they start to think about how they can utilize sort of that long draft and piece it into the question. So that's one really good way to think about it.
And that gives you something to talk about with you and with whoever is the Leeway staff reviewing your work. And it gives you a place to start because you can't really start from scratch. You have to kind of like dump and then it gives you something to work with.
It's really good advice too, especially thinking about that after you're thinking about the experience page. Like, what are those buckets? What are the stories I want to tell? How does that define how I answer these 6 questions? Gabe, thank you for pulling this up on your screen. You're amazing. If you go to the application itself, you've got the guidelines here. This is basically artist information. This is all easy stuff, name, address, things like that. You're going to be asked for your pronoun, how you heard about it. You're going to be asked if you can provide age and residency documentation. Essentially, if you move on to stage 2, we're going to make sure that you live in our funding region and also that you're over 18. You can choose, if you want feedback, and then we actually get into the application. You'll see sort of your artistic disciplines. You have room to select a primary and a secondary artistic discipline. And then you'll see those social change intents and visions that we were talking about. These are that places where you can identify at least 1, but no more than 3. So you've got starting with cultural preservation, decarceration, demilitarization, disability justice, economic justice, environmental justice, feminism, housing justice, immigrant justice, indigenous sovereignty, LGBTQA social movements, racial justice, and trans justice and gender self-determination. You'll be asked for a short artist bio, 3 to 5 sentences. Here's that experience page. Don't get fooled by these lines, thinking that you can only write 3 words. You can give us more than that. Your highlighted experience, and then the questions, all 6 of them. And so first question is going to really ask about describe your art for social change practice, giving a sense of your practice, its discipline and cultural content, what that's been for 5 years, and then how's it evolved, right? So that question is all about what's your practice look like and how has it changed since you began, if at all. Second question asks you to build on that with specific examples of that work in the past 5 years or prior, right? And so question number 1 is sort of the overview of your practice. And question number 2 asks you to dive deeper into some specific examples that illustrate what you just talked about in question number 1. Question number 3 is all focused on your social change intent. It asks you were asked to identify a social change intent for your artistic or cultural practice. Explain how your practice engages with that intent and how does your art create action around that intent, right? So really thinking about if I'm saying my work is disability justice, how does my work actually create some change in the community for folks that are disabled or push forward justice with a disability intention behind it? Question number 4 is going to ask you to define your communities. So this question is about you, right? Define your community, what factors, and then you'll see a couple intersections listed there: ability, education, geography, gender, race, religion, etc. And that list could go on. What factors have led you to identify with or become a part of this community? And how does your community and your identity influence your work? Right? So like, really, who are you? And what led you here to do your art for social change based work? Number 5 builds on that and asks, who's your community? Number 4 is about you. Number 5 is about your people that you create your work for. Define the communities your art for social change practice engages. In what ways is the community involved in your work, right? So who are they? But not only who you create your work for, or who you create your work with, how are they actually a part of this thing that you do, right? It's more than just butts and seats most of the time, right? And I'm thinking about that from like a performance practice. There's lots of ways, I'm sure, that your community is engaged with and involved in your work. Help the panel understand a little bit about that. And then last but not least, the 6th question, it asks you to describe the social change impact of your work on the audiences who experience it or the communities who engage with it. And then describe its impact in Greater Philadelphia, right? If it's being measured, we'll ask, how's it being measured? But Leeway is a regional funder. We only fund the Greater Philadelphia region. And so the panel really wants to understand, how is your work actually creating some change here? Like, what's the impact that you see? And this doesn't have to be like quantity, like numbers. We're not asking for, I've had 70,000 people at my events over the last 30 years. We're not looking for those, but what is the impact? If you have those, great, include them, right? But what is the impact of your work in this region? And are you measuring it? How do you know that your work is doing what you think it's doing? How do you know that it's hitting in the ways that you're intending it to hit? And so that can be a big question. And that's where you really need to take some time and some space to think about it and dream about what that looks like. Those were the 6 questions, big buckets. Amelia, was there one that was particularly challenging for you, or one that you want to give folks an extra heads up for? You're on mute, my friend.
You'd think after like 3 years of this that I would be an expert. Yeah, I would just say that they were all so interconnected for me. So it was just hard to fit everything in that I wanted to fit in. And like I would just say, and also to have it all make sense and tell that coherent story. So yeah, there wasn't one that in particular that I really struggled with. I will say that when you're finding like, oh, there's not enough space to fit everything in, and I'm not willing to like throw one of my babies out the window, I found that the experience section is a great place to hide some nuggets. And that first question that asks you about the highlighted experience is another place to fit in a lot. So just keep that in mind. But I think that you're going to have to make peace also with the fact that you can't include everything. But there's creative ways to try to include, to maximize what can be included.
Absolutely. Great advice around make peace with it. You will have to do some editing, right? It's impossible to fit everything you do in the 6 questions, truly.
Right. And like, I think that when you were in a previous info session, you had mentioned there were some folks who got it and they were really young. So they didn't have as much experience as maybe like, people who have been in the game for 30 years. And just imagining that they were able to explain what they did well enough, even though like maybe their pot was this big, and as someone with 30 years experience is that big, they were able to get the award with only this much experience. So that to me goes to show it's not about listing every single thing. It's about answering these questions thoughtfully and really getting your point across, and keeping that in mind.
Beautifully said. Gabe, thank you for walking us through that application. You can totally pull this down now, and I'm just gonna let it be Amelia and I as we close out. Amelia, what you just offered folks, sort of as this last piece to think about, was that there is no, there's oftentimes a misunderstanding that this award is only for elders, right? Or folks who have decades of experience under their belt. And yes, it is for elders who are amazing and deserving and should definitely apply for this award, but it's also for emerging artists too, who have at least 5 years. The youngest recipient was 19, the oldest recipient was 91. Okay, so there is no one size fits all approach to this application. It is figuring out, does this award align with what I do, right? And if it does, how do I approach this work in the way that feels honest to who I am as an artist for social change? Things to keep in mind, because I know we're slightly over time right now, and I want to be conscious of that. Stage 1 doesn't include work samples, but you should definitely be thinking about, ooh, if I do go to stage 2, how am what I'm writing about in stage 1 setting them up to see what they might request later from the panel in stage 2, right? So if you talk about it in stage 1, be thinking about, do I have a sample that I can show them around that? Because you might be talking about testimony 52nd Street, and they might say to you, hey, I want to see 52nd Street. I want to see it, right? And you might be up the creek without a panel if you say, uh-oh, I don't really have that sample ready yet, So even though they're not part of this stage 1 process, be thinking about what your work sample might be, even as you're writing your stage 1 application. The other thing to keep in mind is there is 5 people on this panel. Only one of them will be from the Philadelphia area. So they will be from other spaces and cities and towns throughout the nation, right? And so the person from Philly will be the past LTA recipient. They will have done this process, walk through it themselves. And so they'll have that experience on them too. So they'll be able to say, yeah, this application's really hard. I walked through it, right? But maybe there's a panelist from the Bay Area or New York. How do you give them the context that they might need for anything that's specific to Philly, right? And so you might be talking about how Norris Square is a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood, right? But they might not know that. So if you don't tell them, they're not going to know that. You might be talking about venues like Taller Puertorriqueño or the Kimmel Center. If you're in Philly, you know that those 2 venues are very different, right? But the panelist might not know unless you give them some context for what those differences are, or what the specific thing about your practice and its relationship to Philadelphia is transformative and important and impactful in your life. The other thing to think about is everyone who applies gets feedback, even if they move on to stage 2. So Amelia, you got feedback between stage 1 and stage 2. What was that process like?
It was really helpful. I found that the feedback was very encouraging. It was a little bit tough because some of it was a little abstract. And then it's just like, how do I want to give them what they want, but what, and how do I, try to work on just kind of finishing this, and then also giving them an answer to this abstract question. But, if you give yourself enough time, and your goal is to at least reflect back that you read what they said and demonstrate that you've attempted to respond thoughtfully, they really do notice it. And I believe that I got a follow-up comment saying that they appreciated that I answered their question. So, it really does matter. And I think it makes a big difference.
Absolutely. When they are reading, if you progress to stage 2, they have your feedback from stage 1 right in front of them as they look at your second stage application. So even if you can't exactly answer their questions, seeing that you attempted to, or demonstrating that you at least read the feedback and took it into an account, can go a really long way in this process. The thing that they do not respond well to, and this is across many panels I've seen, is when you don't give a rat's ass, for lack of a better word, about any questions or commentary that they've offered you there. They'll also tell you what they liked a lot of the time too, and that can be really helpful. Sometimes you think about the thing as like, ooh, what's the thing they're critiquing? I have to work on that. But also, what's the thing they were excited about? How does that inform what you might provide them in the second stage if you make it through, you know? And so take that feedback seriously. And if it is heady or vague, come and talk to staff. We can help you break it down and try and make sense of it as we go throughout. Amelia, any last thoughts you want to share with folks?
I just want to encourage everyone to take the time to do this. It's really worthwhile. At the very least, it will set you up to apply to other applications in the future. And I just encourage you to also get outside eyes on what you're writing, and give yourself as much time as possible to tweak and refine. Not everyone is great at writing, and not everyone is great at grant writing specifically, which is very different than even any other kind. So it's okay to get help from people. You're worthy of getting help from people. And, you know, sometimes that involves bartering. Sometimes that involves paying someone a couple $100 to help you work on your language. That's really, as an artist, an independent artist, it's really important to invest in yourself in that way so that you can set yourself up for success and not just be like wasting your time with applications and not getting it consistently, but, you know, making sure that when you put something out there, it's the best thing that you possibly can put out there. That's the last thing I would say.
Yes, invest in yourself, right? And that doesn't always have to be monetarily. That can be a time investment in yourself, because time is a resource too, or an investment to get at us for a support, you know? I know we're 10 minutes over, but are there any questions that Amelia or Leeway folk can answer for anybody who's on the call right now? I'm gonna unpin us.
Hi, this is
Yeah.
Mafalda. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I had a question, Amelia, and thank you for your comments, your feedback, your points of interest. And Melissa, always we thank you for being such a, great supporter, in the Leeway efforts. I wanted to ask application number one and stage one and stage two, the timelines and how much are the two stages related on the application?
Yeah, great question. Stage one and stage two closely related. They're like two threads of the same blanket, okay? Or the same weaving that you're creating. Stage two application builds completely on your stage one application. It's going to be the same panel who's evaluating your stage one application and your stage two application, right? And so they're going to remember you. They're going to have, if you make it to stage two, they're going to be like, we invited Sister Mafalda back. We want to see her again, right? And so that's why that feedback in between the two stages is so important, if you make it to stage two, because it's going to be the same people making the decisions.
Yeah, and I would just say the content is going to be an expansion of what you introduced in the first one. So you don't want to, like, I was kind of thinking too, like, oh, this is how I'm going to squeeze in 10 more things to say. But you just want to introduce ideas in phase one and then expand on the details in phase two, not introduce whole new concepts and thoughts.
Right. Stage one, think about it like, yes, it has to stand alone, right? But how do you get them interested enough to want to see you in stage two again? And how is it clear enough that they can picture it and they want to see more in stage two? You know, it's like a really good appetizer. You're like, it really set the foundation for that delicious meal I'm about to get in stage two, you know? Sister,
you're muted.
You're muted.
Still muted. There we
You
go.
have no idea. Thank you. You have no idea what the questions are. unless you get invited back to stage 2. You don't know where it's, right?
That is correct, right? Come and chat with me. We can talk about
Ah.
what questions might be there. Okay.
Will do.
They're going to also be, in the words of Amelia 2 minutes ago, right? They're going to be an expansion thinking about, there's going to be work samples. And so it's going to be work sample specific. Some of those questions about like, what did you upload as your work samples? What are we seeing? How do these work samples illustrate your art for social change practice? So some of them will be focused on your work samples. And some of the questions are as easy as, I say easy, but how would receiving this award impact you is a question in the second stage. Like, how would this receiving $15,000 impact your life? And people answer that in all kinds of ways, right? They're like, I could take time off. I could fix my teeth. I could pay my rent for a little bit. I could put a down payment on a house, it means all kinds of different things. So those are just 2 examples of what you might see in stage 2.
How many are selected as a final question? Thanks for the time. How
Yeah.
many are selected after, meaning for the final LTA award?
10 to 12 folks.
Oh,
So we usually get between 75 and 90 folks who apply for stage 1. That panel has the space to invite up to 30 to stage 2. They usually almost always invite 30. I've never seen them invite less than 25, real talk. And then they'll narrow that 30 down to 10 to 12 people who receive the award each year.
thanks.
Cool, thank you. Anything else? Thank you, folks in the chat. Emerson, Anna, thank you for staying on if you're still with us. So helpful. We were going a little deep tonight.
Right. Yeah, thank you guys. I'm so happy to have been able to be here with you all and give back to Leeway in some small way. And I'm just really appreciative of everything that, I've gotten from this organization and the lovely staff who have worked there. So
Yeah.
thank you for being here.
Thank you all for being here. In the chat, if you want to sign up for one-on-one app support, you'll see that in the chat.
Sorry, I have one question, if it still have time.
Yeah, we have
yeah.
time for you. Amelia, do you have
Okay.
time? You can go if you need to.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Just one question. As I can gather, this is about the work that you have done. In this case, year-wise is 5 years. What part of the application, or is there any space for the application for us to tell our plan, future work, what do we want to do? Is there is there a way to express that, or
Yeah,
what's your
that's a
suggestion?
great question, Deddy.
Yeah.
Deddy, let me say this right away. I'm happy to see you here tonight, Deddy. I've been hearing all about your work from my colleagues,
Oh,
so I'm glad you're here.
thank you.
Deddy, for LTA, there's not a lot of space in the application about future work, right?
Okay.
Because it is for work that has already happened. It's an award that recognizes past work. But there is a grant stream called the Art and Change Grant, and that is a project-based application. That if you're thinking about, I have a project I want to do, but I need funding behind it, an Art and Change Grant might be a good place to start.
I see. So the transformation award is almost like a reward kind of award, something or the hard work that you have done, this is a reward for you as an appreciation or acknowledgement. Something like that.
Yep, that's a great way to think about it, actually, because they are going to be thinking about like, what's the work that you've done? I mean, Deddy, we can also talk offline because there might be lots of work you've done too.
Right.
So,
this is the first time I try to like put it all together like a puzzle, so I was just thinking, okay, all right.
Totally.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Cheers. You well. Anyone else? Going once, going twice. We got 2 minutes left.
Thank
Congratulations. I'm sure everybody will join me with that. Congratulations.
Yes, we are joining you, Amelia.
Yeah, there's so few opportunities to like celebrate, I feel like sometimes. So it's good to celebrate with you all.
Absolutely. All right. Well, folks, thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much for being here. If there's any way that we can be of assistance, let us know and we'll talk soon.
Thanks. Have a good night.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Amelia. Thank you,
Thank
Melissa.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Daddy.